Of course, our thoughts feed into the emotions. Breathing is picking up on that. But breathing is one of the main functions that really responds to a threat or a perceived risk or a worry or an anxiety. And even if we have those thoughts in our head, real or imagined, if it's an imagined situation, we will still react with faster, harder breathing. The group of people who are more prone to dysfunctional breathing patterns. And what I mean by dysfunctional breathing is when your breathing is off a little bit every minute, every hour, every day.
Hello, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Patrick McKeown. Patrick is someone whose work I have followed for years, and I've actually been very lucky got to meet him as well at a live event. He's one of the leading experts in breathing and oxygen efficiency, and his work has played a huge role in reshaping how we understand breathing and health. In my work, I always talk about nervous system regulation, because if the nervous system doesn't feel safe, the body won't truly rebalance in terms of sleep, hormones, metabolic function. But breathing is one of the most powerful and overlooked ways we signal safety to the body. Patrick, thanks so much for being here. When I was preparing for this, was realizing that even 2 years ago when we met, there still was, James Nestor's book, your teachings, and there wasn't really a whole lot more, but I think it's evolved quite a bit in the last 2 years, even through the social media perspective, that people are realizing how detrimental so much mouth breathing is and the importance of nasal breathing. But let's just start with why you think breathing has become almost a lost art, as you frame it, in modern life.
Yeah, interesting question, Becca. I suppose I was waiting 23 years for this to happen. Breathing is always something very, very powerful. It's always been there, but I think it was very poorly communicated. I think a lot of breathing instructors were scratching the surface. They may have been saying, I teach breathing exercises, and I would say, like, what do you teach? Well, I teach 4, 7, 8. Breathing in for 4, holding for 7, out for 8. Or I teach breathing in for 4 and out for 6, or breathing in for 5 and out for 5. And that's a purpose. That's a snippet in time. That's something that you can do in the moment. It's not going to be for everybody. It's not going to suit the person who needs it the most, but it does nothing to address underlying breathing patterns.
Yeah.
It does nothing to address whether a person is breathing through their nose or mouth, breathing high or low, breathing irregular, having a strong drive to breathe. It does nothing to address the link between the fear response, the amygdala, and the connection with breathing. It does have to bring balance to the nervous system, which might be a small contradiction with my previous statement. But what I'm talking about, what is breathing and where do we take this one? And for me, it's a tool. You weave it into your everyday life. It's always accessible. And there's so much you can do with the breath. And that's where breathing is. So yeah, it's taken off. Like, social media has driven it. Probably a lot of youngsters now are kind of very conscious about their looks, as youngsters always are conscious about their looks. But they realize that if you have your mouth open persistently and you have a low tongue resting posture, that it affects the development and the growth of the face. And overcrowding of teeth or crooked teeth are a sign of that. But it's never just about the aesthetics. A face that doesn't grow the way it should grow, that's going to impact the airway. And that's not just isolated to childhood, that carries into adulthood. So there's even a bigger conversation around all of that as well.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast you were on, and you spoke about historically how, the palate has changed and the size of the mouth and the teeth become overcrowded because, the way we're cooking food, essentially. So we're the only creature that's experiencing that. Most animals have straight set of teeth and they're breathing effectively. We, through time, have done the opposite. And you see now so much people breathing, regularly through the mouth. Just after your workshop you did with me on that live event, I did a marathon, and the entire training up to that, I really just focused on the nose breathing, and it completely transformed my run, my recovery, and how relaxed I felt. And that was the first time I really was like, this is actually so significant, but it almost is downplayed because it seems so obvious, but people are not aware they're doing it incorrectly. Like, I have so many clients and we talk about, diaphragmatic breathing. And initially, a lot of people don't realize until you test it that you are breathing regularly from the chest. And so no wonder sleep is so negatively impacted. And it really made me realize no wonder so much people feel anxiety very regularly, because if you're breathing from the chest, as you'll probably elaborate now, it really means that we're in much more of a sympathetic response. So that's something we can talk about first of all. And also the blind spot a lot of people have to regularly chest breathing and mouth breathing that they're not aware of.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think it was what you said at the very start, that our breathing, however we breathe, it's telling the brain whether we're safe or not. Because the brain has to weigh this information, and it's not always about our thoughts. Of course, our thoughts feed into the emotions. Breathing is picking up on that. But breathing is one of the main functions that really responds to a threat or a perceived risk or a worry or an anxiety. And even if we have those thoughts in our head, real or imagined, if it's an imagined situation, we will still react with faster, harder breathing. The group of people who are more prone to dysfunctional breathing patterns, and what I mean by dysfunctional breathing, it's when your breathing is off a little bit every minute, every hour, every day. And the best way to think about that is ask yourself, how do you breathe when you get into a stressful situation? Your breathing gets faster, harder, upper chest, irregular. You might sigh more, you might stop breathing. You're breathing through an open mouth. You don't have a slow, relaxed exhalation. You typically have a faster exhalation. And also the pause between breaths. As soon as you breathe out, there's no natural pause before you need to breathe back in again. So that's how we breathe when we're stressed. But if we're breathing a little bit like that every day, our body is literally telling the brain that we're stressed. Our body is telling the brain there's a threat. Our brain is here to protect us. And the number one function of the brain is to get us out of that situation. But it's not just that our breathing is communicating to the brain. Our brain is literally spying on our breathing as well. Now, we can either use that to our advantage, or if we're not aware of that link, we are going to be hostage to that. Because, you can have a mouth-breathing child or a mouth-breathing adult. And of course, mouth breathing is going to involve faster breathing and upper chest breathing. And that's putting you into a stress response. But it's not just isolated to during the day. It's also to during sleep. Because if you're breathing fast and mouth and upper chest during sleep, you're more prone to airway narrowing. You're more prone to insomnia. You're more prone to lighter sleep. You're not waking up feeling as refreshed. You're already in a sympathetic drive. Because if we don't get adequate recovery from deep sleep, if we're not getting that transitioning, say, from stage 1, which is light sleep, into stage 2, which is still light sleep but a bit deeper, into stage 3 sleep, this is really where the good stuff is happening. The brain is cleaning itself. It's getting rid of the buildup of toxins that have accumulated during the day. And then if we go into REM sleep, memories are consolidated. So whatever day experiences that we've had, the brain is sorting all of that stuff out. So we know when we wake up feeling alert. And when you wake up feeling alert, you're really ready to start the day, but it really has been an amazing recovery for you. And now your autonomic nervous system is more in balance. But it goes both ways. If our breathing is off, our sleep is off. If our sleep is off, our breathing is off. If our breathing is off, the mind is off. If the mind is off, our breathing is off. But also, if the mind is off, our sleep is off. Now, you might ask, well, where am I going with this? It's through the breath we can influence our sleep, and it's through the breath we can influence the mind. And when we think about the autonomic nervous system, can we bring balance to the nervous system? Can we dampen that stress response and, activate the relaxation response? Can we do it if we ignore breathing, and if we ignore sleep, and if we ignore the mind?
It's all so interconnected. And it's interesting what you said initially about when we look at 4, 7, 8 breathing, for example, or the physiological sigh as a regulation technique. But we look at that in isolation. And like you say, we haven't trained the body how to use the breath properly at that point. So you're using that tool in the moment to breathe in a deeper way. But what happens between the moments of regulation you do intentionally, if you're breathing in an incorrect way, of course, you go into that fight or flight response more regularly. So that's a very interesting point of how important for the deeper level of regulation and the big picture of regulation, the breath is between all them great things you're doing, like the meditations and all the other work. But if in between you're having them thoughts or the external events that are making you feel stressed, and your breathing is affected. So I know so much people that have done your courses in breathwork, and it really does transform your life, because when you learn how to harness your breathing, most of the time in an efficient way, of course, that's a huge part of you feeling calm and in rest and digest state.
Oh, it's a very important tool. If somebody was to ask me what's the biggest benefit of tapping into your breathing and using the breath, I think the biggest benefit is to be able to bring a quietness to the mind. I'll always come back to that, and I know your former life, if I can remember correctly, you were a school teacher.
Correct, yeah.
And, if we think we spend, I was only adding it up, if you spend a minimum of 12 to 15 years in formal education, And we all do. We go into school at 4 or 5 years of age. We come out of high school or secondary school at the age of 18. 50% of us then go on to graduate. We go on to university. We're another 4 years there. So from the age of 5 years of age to the age of 22 years of age, now we're talking about 18 years of full-time education. And we come out of full-time education not knowing how to self-regulate, not knowing how to differentiate between thinking that's helpful and practical and thinking that's not helpful and often self-critical, not knowing how to bring a quietness to the mind, not knowing how to direct our attention, not knowing all of the factors that help to reduce rumination of the mind. If we're learning how to use our brain, and that's what education is about, we really need to be taking a step back and ask, what can I do to influence my brain health? That number one, I'm in a much better position to learn. Number two, I have a skill for the rest of my life. Like I spent 18 years in formal education. Initially, I left school at 14. I never told people that because back in the 1980s, if you were to leave school at 14 years of age, people would be, they'd have an opinion on that. They'd be saying, what were your parents thinking about all of that? I was headstrong. I didn't like school. I got nothing out of school when I was there because I was the kid in class with the mouth open. I had terrible sleep quality, I had a stuffy nose, and I had asthma. And I would be looking at the teacher. I wasn't disruptful. I wasn't, I didn't get into trouble. I wasn't disruptful, but I had ADD. So I was sitting in the chair. I was looking at the teacher. So to all intents purposes, I was paying attention to what the teacher was saying, but I wasn't because I was lost in my head. I was stuck in my head. I didn't have the capacity or the energy or the wherewithal or the knowledge to know that for me to learn material, I need to be able to pay attention to what the teacher is saying. And, I came out at 14, I says, I wanted to own my own supermarket. I ended up going back to school. I worked hard. I got my points, got into university in Dublin, got my degree, and I worked 10, 12 hours a day to do that. Now, a lot of kids wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have had that drive, and I suppose that's the way some people will do it and some people don't do it. But this is where education should be. So coming back to the breath itself, there is a way to improve blood flow to the brain, but there's also a way to decrease blood flow to the brain. There is a way to increase rumination of the mind, and there's also a way to decrease rumination of the mind. And it's not just by doing meditation. Like meditation, people will often talk about, of course, it's brilliant. It has its purpose. You're paying attention to the breath, into the body, your present moment awareness. You're paying attention to what you're thinking about, and that gives you great insight. But how about changing your breathing patterns? How about breathing less air to slightly increase carbon dioxide in the lungs and blood, to improve blood flow to the brain between 5 and 10%? How about breathing less air and more regular breathing patterns so that your pH is normal? And this can help to reduce brain cell excitability. How about breathing in and out through your nose with a better recruitment of the diaphragm so that you have the signaling from the diaphragm to the brain? And also there's areas of the brain called the default mode network. And these are different parts of the brain that light up when we go into mind wandering. And normally a human, we spend about 50% of our time lost in thought, thinking, and very often thinking about stuff that's unrelated to what we are actually doing. So on the face of it, it's very normal for a human being to 50% of their time throughout the day, irrespective of what they are doing that time, they're not actually paying attention to what they are doing because they're stuck in their head. And that's normal. But what about a person with anxiety? What about a person with racing mind or children with ADD and ADHD? How much time are they spending stuck in their heads? So we need to have a conversation about what can we do that's most direct, and the issue with overthinking causes anxiety. Overthinking makes us less happy. And the reason being is because if we're thinking a lot, very often that thinking is not helpful. It can be very critical, very judgmental of ourselves. So if the problem is overthinking, we need to learn how to stop thinking. We need to learn how to bring a gap between thoughts, and we can learn to do that. So anyway, long story short, that's my input about breathing.
But it is very important to recognize, like you're saying, in order to control the mind, you need to be doing something in the body that makes the body feel safe. And breathing is like the quickest way to create safety in the body, to allow that pause. Otherwise, and I can speak from so much experience, like even the ADHD in school, not being able to fully concentrate. But even when we go back to school, thinking of a lot of the barriers to good breathing is even the way we're sitting all day, slouched forward and writing at a desk. They're hugely important. And even I see with my 5-year-old twins now, at the mouth breathing at night. And, I have your own brand of the mouth tape, which is really helpful. And I use that myself. But I'm really noticing a lot of kids are doing the mouth breathing even at night. I can hear the little snores sometimes. And it's really interesting how that's developing. But I want to just circle back to the point of, that overthinking, a lot of people are experiencing the connection to your breath, and very few people would make that deeper connection. But if we drill into that for a moment, because I think a lot of people that listen to this would really ruminate a lot and overthink a lot and be stuck in that cycle of running the to-do list through your mind, and you almost feel guilt when you rest the mind. And I think there's two factors playing into this, and breathing being one. Societal expectations and your productivity linked to your self-worth another. But let's drill into the breath part of it.
Yeah, I suppose I can talk from personal experience because, normally it'll give you just a bit more of an experience to it. I always felt there was something off with what was going on in my mind, but I never considered myself to have anxiety. I never had any diagnosis or anything like that. But I felt that something was off. There was no way that the mind was conducting the way it was conducting. I didn't feel that was normal. And it was just through a series of events. I remember on one instance that I went to a couple of talks about the mind, and the person who was giving the talk was in the state of presence. Now, I know that sounds woo-woo, but by that person, well, it's good. But, when you talk about it, not everybody gets it. But that's why I would say to anybody who's listening, just kind of bear with me a little bit, because I don't consider myself woo-woo or left to field in any shape or form. But there's something that's going on there that's not explained by science. And when you have an individual that's in that state of presence, the person who's listening is more receptive, and a gentle quietness comes to the mind. Now, that was one thing that I remember coming out of a talk. It was in the Shelbourne Hotel in Dublin. I was in my early 20s. I was highly stressed at the time. I walked down Grafton Street, and it was the first time I actually saw the street. I can vividly remember all my senses, that I wasn't trapped in my head walking down the street. I saw the street. I felt the street. I was listening to the sounds, the smells, the tastes, all of that, and I was immersed in it. In other words, I wasn't just walking down the street, walking in body, but my attention stuck in my head. Now, when I woke up the next morning, I was back to the mind, but it planted a seed. And then and that's all it took. That was one insight. And it was kind of weird because I came across mindfulness, spirituality, and breathing all in the same, within 2 years of each other. I went to another talk, and the talk talked about differentiating between thoughts that are very practical and thoughts that are not so practical, thoughts that are helpful and thoughts that are not so helpful. And I never thought, should we be paying attention to what we're thinking about? And of course, the answer is absolutely yes, because the mind is the filter through which we interpret all of our life's experience. And yet we don't actually stand back and ask, what am I thinking about? And we will always have difficult situations in our life. Life will always throw a curveball on us, always. And, we can be immersed in that difficult situation and really dragging it all over us. And I'm not saying not to think about it, but I'm saying at some point to understand that, yes, we are thinking about it a lot, and it's making us feel very heavy. And we need to be able to tell the brain that we're okay. We need to be able to bring a softness to the body, to the mind. Yes, a terrible situation has happened, but in many ways, the mind is amplifying the situation way beyond the situation. And as you say, people talk about, well, they feel guilty unless we're thinking or unless we're doing something. But if we want to be productive, if we want to be creative, if we want to be able to concentrate, if we want to be able to hold our attention, we have to have some degree of ability to be able to stop thinking, or at least to reduce thought activity so we can direct our attention to where we want to direct it upon. So at the very start, I found it helpful to start paying attention, which is simply awareness. What am I thinking about? What effect are those thoughts having on me? I'm thinking negative thoughts. I'm self-critical. Okay. Are those thoughts productive? Are they doing anything to sort out the situation? No, they're not. I'm just on a merry-go-round. It's just like a broken record. So it's just a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. And it's making me feel lousy. Like, it's the reality that we cannot be happy if we're having a lot of sad thoughts. We cannot be happy if we're having a lot of worrying thoughts. We cannot be happy if we're anxious about the future or regrets over the past. But we don't often know what we're thinking about. But yet our body is reacting to our thoughts. So it's all happening in the background, but yet it's having a huge impact on what we're doing. So this is what I was coming back to with education at the very, very start. If we are developing the human brain, we should be giving people the capacity to be able to differentiate between the thoughts that are helpful and productive. A child goes in and does some maths. A child is learning English or Spanish or French or whatever they learn. It's all productive. And we are developing the analytical mind there. And we can't just be developing one side of the mind or the analytical mind and completely ignoring the other. Because the other thing we have to ask is, if we develop the brain into this sharp analytical tool, is there two sides to that? The side that's helpful, but the side that's not so helpful. So that was one aspect to it. But another aspect which really changed my life was switching to nasal breathing in terms of reducing rumination of the mind. And even if you do, say, for example, if you go for a walk with your mouth closed, during that time, your body is walking, you're producing more carbon dioxide because it's a byproduct of your metabolism. And if your mouth is closed, you will increase carbon dioxide in the lungs and blood. And the reason being is because you're breathing in and out through your nose. And as carbon dioxide increases in your blood, it will naturally increase blood flow to the brain. So now you're walking with your mouth closed and you have an increase of blood flow to the brain by probably about 5% or so. And not only are you having an increase of blood flow to the brain, you're also having increased oxygen delivery to the brain. Also, because of the slight increase of carbon dioxide, there's a slight drop to blood pH. And that in turn reduces brain cell excitability. So a lot of people who do physical exercise for mental health, they should simply switch their physical exercise to breathing in and out through the nose, whether it's walking, jogging, dancing, yoga, whatever you're doing. And I'm talking about breathing in and out through the nose. Not breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. Another aspect was sleep. I can remember waking up. I'd started taping my own mouth closed. This was late 1990s, and I woke up the second morning. It was incredible because I woke up feeling really refreshed. And, if you wake up in that state, it's an amazing start to your day. And your ability to get through things is unbelievable. Your ability to make decisions. Because we know that when we don't wake up with feeling refreshed, we procrastinate because we don't trust ourselves, but we don't have the same judgment. It's not easy to rationalize and make decisions when you don't have the energy levels to do that. But when you're getting through stuff because of the pressures that we have in our everyday life, we are making decisions all day long. We need to be at optimum performance. So then, I suppose it's tying all of those together. And I don't want to make this something more complicated, but there are simple things that we should be doing in terms of the brain and reducing rumination. Number one, absolutely pay attention to what we're thinking about. Number two, are those thoughts, are they helpful or are they unhelpful? Number three, if you find that you have a lot of unhelpful thoughts, be easy on yourself. This isn't about saying, oh my God, here I'm thinking about this now. What am I doing that? No, just go easy on yourself. At least now you're starting to notice it. It was already happening. Now you're bringing it to the front. Now you're bringing it to the surface. You're noticing it. This is tremendous. It's an amazing step because now you realize just how active the human mind is. And I'm saying this, the human mind, not your mind per se, but the mind. And it has been conditioned and shaped by so many different influences. But then we need to bring a holiday to the brain. We need to bring a holiday to the mind. How can we do that? Bring our attention onto the breath. Go for a walk with your mouth closed. Bring your attention into the body. Bring your attention into present moment awareness. And there's nothing woo-woo about giving people the capacity to be able to direct your attention to where they want to direct it upon. Because on a positive note, when you know what's going on in your mind, to a certain degree. I'm not saying 100% throughout the day, because of course the mind wanders and it might be a little bit before you pick up on it, but then you bring your attention back onto your breathing. It is an amazing tool if you want to be productive and reach your full potential. Self-actualization, we are all striving to reach it, and we will never reach it if we're going around with our mouth open, if we're having lousy sleep quality, and if we are stuck in our head. That's where we need to go with this.
You painted that very clearly, and you can see as well, depending on the state your nervous system is in, you're going to look at life through that lens. So if you're mouth breathing all day, you're stuck in that fight or flight response. Of course, you're going to see life in a completely different way. You ruminate more, you have more negative thoughts. And for me, I've always been a journaler. It's been so important. Some people like to reflect, I like to write. I have since I was about 11 or 12, I've always kept a journal. And that self-awareness piece is so important, but also consistently reminding yourself that you live through the state you're in. Let's try and be in rest and digest as regularly as possible. And the breath is a really key way to do that. And even since that marathon in 2023, maybe 2024, and I started to really pay attention to the breath. Yes, doing, actual breath work per se sessions, but more so on a day-to-day basis, really making an effort. Because I would always have noticed when I would have ran, my nose would have always ran. So I ended up mouth breathing. And I have a deviated septum, all the stuff. But now you, like you say in your books, in your podcast, you train the nose to breathe. And it was really interesting. You said before, out of like 7,000 people you worked with at one point, this is probably a few years back, 15 couldn't get the nasal breathing, and that was so striking to me, because the nose is like a use it or lose it scenario. So lots of people think I'm just a mouth breather by nature, because the nose it's like a muscle. You haven't been working the muscle. You haven't been using the nose. So I think for anyone that thinks, I just mouth breathe, that's the way I am, that's really important. Because I would have thought, look, my nose was broke a few times with sport when I was young. This is it. I'm just going to be mouth breathing with a runny nose when I run. I do physical activity. I would do a lot of triathlon, high rocks, all them things. And I was just like, that's it now. I have to just deal with it. But your performance, your recovery, your mindset completely changes when you really focus on the nose breathing. And like you say, it's not just the stereotypical, breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. There's that's short form content idea of holotropic breath work, 4-7-8, physiological sigh, which probably has a lot of gaps in it, because we're not really understanding the mechanism of what's happening in the body for actual real optimal breathing, like X amount of breaths per minute. So I think let's go into that for a moment, because you say that really nicely in your books, the simple science of it and why it's so important. And even when James Clear did that kind of experiment where he blocked his nose and mouth breathed for many days, and that was really poignant and it's significant, because it showed how much his life quality was negatively impacted because of how detrimental it was to his sleep. So yeah, let's get into that and really fully understand it and knock away the misconceptions of, when we go back to that 4-7-8 example, what people really think versus what's true about correct breathing.
Totally. You mentioned James Clear there. Atomic Habits is a good book, and James Nestor is the book on breath, but two good authors. So all about the nose, you rightly pointed out that many people are open mouth breathing. They're not even aware of it. And it's almost that there's been no attention paid whatsoever to it. Even if we think of Ireland, UK, United States, asthma, 8 to 10% of the population. Many of those individuals, children or adults, they will open mouth breathe, because when there's a problem with the lungs, there's normally a problem with the nose. And, if we think of the human lungs, the nose is the organ that's helping all of that air before it arrives to the lungs. There's nothing inside the mouth that does anything for the breath. All you have to do is look inside the mouth. What is in there? Our teeth, our tongue, hard palate, soft palate, saliva, the floor of the mouth, gums, etc. And that's it. So everything inside the mouth is devoted to eating, for drinking, and for speaking. The nose has a minimum of 31 functions. Even brainwave activity is influenced by nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. Recruitment of the diaphragm, gas exchange, carbon dioxide, protecting, of course, the airways, more open airways, bronchodilation with the gas nitric oxide. We obviously went through COVID as being an airborne virus. nobody talked about nose breathing. You know, even the simple thing was, I remember being in a tube in London back in February of 2020, and it was packed. This train was absolutely packed of people. And people knew about COVID at the time. It was starting, news was getting out there. And I was thinking to myself, well, maybe the person next to me could have COVID, or maybe this person here has COVID. So I wanted to minimize the dose. I wanted to minimize, if somebody next to me had COVID, I want to take in as little of this virus into my body as possible, because then my body has some shot at being able to defend itself. So I breathed it in and out through my nose, but I breathed hardly any air for the duration of the journey. And it just made total sense. You know, so simple things. So coming back to the human nose, we need to start paying attention to whether our mouth is open or closed. And during physical exercise, yes, when you switch to nasal breathing, the air hunger is a bit stronger. But now you're adding an extra load onto your breathing system, not just on the biomechanics, not just because when you breathe through your nose, you're breathing in and out of a narrower space. You know, you have two nostrils compared to a mouth. So it takes more work to breathe in through your nose than it is through the mouth, because your nose is a smaller space for air to come into the body and air to leave. But that in turn is adding an extra load onto your diaphragm. So you're helping to strengthen the diaphragm, you're helping to improve the function of the diaphragm. That's very important. That's linked with high blood pressure. So for example, there's a lot of studies over the last 5-6 years looking at respiratory muscle strength training for helping people with hypertension. So the diaphragm is intimately connected with, for example, the baroreflex or the vagus nerve, and that ties in with the autonomic nervous system. But also from a biochemical point of view, a lot of people aren't aware that every breath that you take, it's not driven by oxygen, but it's actually driven by carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is the gas that you produce inside your body. You're not inhaling this gas from the atmosphere into the body. You're producing it as a byproduct of your metabolism. And it's very important that we have normal carbon dioxide in the lungs and blood. And we only breathe out about 15% of the carbon dioxide we produce. We actually hold on to 85% of it. But if we're breathing in and out through the nose, we have more optimal carbon dioxide in our lungs and blood. And that in turn is improving blood flow and oxygen delivery and brain cell excitability. The other aspect to that is that when we do physical exercise with our mouth closed, we're exposing our body to increased CO2. That in turn helps to improve our tolerance to carbon dioxide, or you could say reduces our sensitivity to the gas. But then our breathing becomes lighter and slower. So, you know, when you're doing physical exercise with your mouth closed and you're thinking, oh my God, the air hunger is a bit stronger, I'm more breathless, you have to bear in mind that, yes, like any athlete, if you want to strengthen something, you add an extra load onto it. So see it as part of your training. The other thing is, by doing physical exercise with your mouth closed, your body adapts to that. And then when you want to do physical exercise, even if you have to do it with your mouth open, your body will be much better that you can do physical exercise with reduced ventilation. I'll give you an example from a health point of view. Professor George Dallam, D-A-L-L-A-M, he wrote a paper on it, a hypothesis, and he looked at endurance athletes. So endurance athletes can be prone to atrial fibrillation, irregular heartbeats. They can be prone to fibrosis of the heart as well, scarring of the heart muscle. And when he looked at their history, they didn't have any genetic predisposition. So this wasn't a family thing. So he put it down to these individuals, they're doing a lot of miles and they're putting their heart under a lot of stress when they are doing physical exercise. But the issue is that they can be putting their heart under a lot of stress, but not giving their heart adequate blood flow. And that in turn then is leading to cardiovascular abnormalities. So his hypothesis was on this, well, if you want to do ultramarathon, or if you want to do a marathon, you want to make sure that your heart gets adequate blood flow. And how can you ensure that? You do the marathon with your mouth closed. Because when you do your physical exercise with your mouth closed, you've increased CO2 in the lungs and blood. That naturally will vasodilate. And it's not just that your heart is responsible for pumping blood throughout the body, but the heart needs adequate blood flow. So you can ensure adequate blood flow, at least you can help ensure adequate blood flow to the heart, and not just to the heart, but also to the brain during physical exercise by simply doing physical exercise with your mouth closed. I'm going to make a prediction on this. Nasal breathing during physical exercise is going to be huge within the next 5 years. I have no doubt about it. because when you break it down, I did a small TEDx talk down in Glen Bay in Kerry. I was about 8 months ago. And that was the talk. That was the topic of my talk. If you want to reduce breathlessness during physical exercise, what do you do? Do you do more training or do you target your breathing? And I looked at all of the factors that influence breathlessness during physical exercise. And 5 out of 6, you target it through your breathing. And only 1 is targeted through your training. And breathlessness during physical exercise, a lot of people are put off doing physical exercise because of the excessive breathlessness. And as a result, because they don't enjoy it. They don't want to do physical exercise because they feel, I just can't do it. I can't go fast enough. I go to a gym, I'm embarrassed. I'm on a treadmill, I'm walking at a pace, and I'm already out of breath. But what is the issue there? Is that poor conditioning due to that individual not doing physical exercise? Or does that individual have a poor breathing pattern? And a recent paper, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but a recent paper on people with chronic heart failure, they looked at just that. And you'll find that I think it was published in Frontiers. If you put in nasal breathing, chronic heart failure, they looked at individuals with chronic heart failure and they fared much better when they did their physical exercise with their mouth closed. Now, Becca, that's only nasal breathing during physical exercise. What about nasal breathing during rest? Give you a couple of points on that. If you're breathing through an open mouth chronically, your mouth tends to be dry. If your mouth tends to be dry, it alters the saliva in the mouth. And you're more at risk of increasing or altering the bacteria in the mouth. So there's an increase of Streptococcus mutans. Your plaque index is higher, more prone to gum disease and dental cavities, but it also alters the microbiome in the mouth. Now you think then you take a cup of tea or you drink a mouthful of water. You're now carrying the microbiome from the mouth, which has been altered due to chronic mouth breathing because the saliva has dried up, and you're carrying that into the gut. And then you think of the connection between the gut and the brain axis. But so dental health, bad breath, upper chest breathing, all of that is linked with breathing during rest. But then sleep, 50% of the population are waking up with a dry mouth in the morning. 50%. And, sleep doctors have not caught up with this yet. It's absolutely amazing. It really, really is. I wrote a review paper on sleep apnea a few years ago with 2 ear, nose and throat doctors. I wrote a book recently enough, The Breathing Cure for Better Sleep. It's absolutely documented for decades of the importance of nasal breathing during sleep. Because when you can have your mouth closed, your tongue is resting in the roof of the mouth, your airway is more open. And with that then, it reduces the resistance to breathing. And if you look at females, we need to have a conversation around female sleep versus male sleep, because there's a lot of females that are suffering and struggling. And when they do a sleep study, the sleep study is coming back as negative. There's nothing wrong with you. Your AHI, the number of apneas and hypopneas per hour of sleep are less than 5. Your blood oxygen isn't desaturating. There's nothing wrong with you. That's not the case. Females don't get away with anything when it comes to resistance to breathing during sleep. And the whole sleep industry has been built around males. Females have been the forgotten gender.
Yeah, completely. And I do so much sleep work with clients, and I find it so interesting what you said earlier on, the disconnect between, we're so quick to look for quick fixes, but the most effective things are usually the most boring and obvious, and they're the things that are glossed over. And I think there's an element of that when it comes to sleep. We're much more gravitating towards, our blood sugar balance, the meal before bed, our ashwagandha, our magnesium, the very tangible things we can do without, looking long term at the breath. And of course, like you say, it's kind of mind-blowing that it's probably one of the most important things for getting into them REM cycles correctly. And so much people can't. And that disconnect between male and female sleep, we should touch on a little bit more. It's very interesting because most people you think that snore are obviously male. Sleep apnea we associate with a man. COPD we usually associate with a smoker woman or an overweight man. And there's a lot of these stereotypes that are happening without understanding the difference of the mechanics and the way women and men sleep and how they get into deep restorative sleep. So I think we go there because, like you say, there's so little data and understanding of female sleep and female breathing.
Yeah, for sure. Whenever it comes to sleep, you have to think of the airway. And the reason being is, if there's any restriction to breathing during sleep, you're going to get pulled out of deep sleep. or if there's any increased effort to breathe during sleep, you're going to get pulled out of deep sleep. So if we want to arrive to deep sleep where all the good stuff happens, we want to make sure that air is able to flow freely. Now, then we ask the question, how can we help with that? It's not going to flow freely if you're breathing in and out through an open mouth. Even if you have diagnosed sleep apnea, even if you're on a CPAP machine, because if you have your mouth open, your lower jaw, the mandible, is falling back. It's narrowing the airway. So it's more difficult now for the air to travel from the mouth into the lungs and back out again. We also have to consider the position of the tongue. You know, if the mouth is open, the tongue is in the low resting posture, the tongue is more likely to encroach the airway, it narrows the airway, it makes breathing more difficult. We're not going to have deep sleep. So the number one thing to consider when it comes to sleep is think about the airway itself. So where do we start with this one? We should be breathing in and out through the nose. If your nose is stuffy, there are exercises you can do to decongest it. If you have a smaller nasal airway, get a nasal dilator. So wear a nasal dilator just to help dilate the nose, so it makes air flow freely, more easier from your nose into the lungs and back out again. If you're waking up with a dry mouth in the morning, use some sort of nasal breathing support. Like we have our own one. If I was to put it out there, it's called myotape. But, you know, it's really about just getting the mouth closed. You don't want to cover the mouth altogether because it's not particularly safe, especially if somebody has obstructive sleep apnea. So it's not about...
That's the nice thing, though, about the myotape. It's designed, so it's made with the way the mouth should be positioned,
Yes.
which is the really nice part. Because I think a lot of people think you just put a little piece of tape in the middle of your lips.
That would have never worked for me. I know James talked about it, you know, it never would have worked for me, or a lot of the clients that I was working with. Initially I was using mouth tape. I was using 3M 1-inch micropore tape, but I would always cover the mouth. But then we realized that if you have an individual who has sleep apnea and they need to mouth puff, it's not safe to cover the mouth because 50% of them get worse. So that's where something like having a nasal breathing support, having something to bring the lips together, but without actually covering the mouth, is very important. So
yes. And with the kids piece as well, I'm so curious. When children are very young and they start to mouth breathe, you know, adults are cognizant and can say, okay, I need to, you know, open up the airway, practice during the day, you know, tape the mouth. When it comes to a young child, how does that pan out? And why is a young child who, you know, you would think a young child hasn't developed any breathing problems, or they're, you know, a healthy, you know, not overweight child, why is that child doing that and doing the mouth breathing?
Yeah, I suppose there's so many reasons behind it, and it's never just one. You know, a child, for example, may be tongue-tied. If the piece of string that's holding the tongue is quite tight to the floor of the mouth, it's difficult then for the child to get the tongue off the roof of the mouth. That child, he or she may have been sucking their thumbs in the womb, and as a result, they have a narrower palate and a narrower nasal airway. Maybe the mother had to go back to work because of, you know, you buy a house in Ireland, you can't get a house for less than, €400,000. Yeah. Nobody in the right mind can afford it unless both parents are working. And of course, mom has her baby, and then she used to go back to work as soon as possible to make sure she's paying the mortgage, which is crazy, you know? Yeah. And so babies can't be breastfed then for the length of time, because breastfeeding isn't just about nutrition, but it's about manipulation of the muscles of the face necessary for craniofacial growth. It takes work for the baby to take the milk from the breast. So it's almost that the baby is getting a workout. Their tongue is getting a workout. The whole face is getting a workout, and it's helping to develop the muscles in the face. And this is very important for aesthetics because, you know, you want your child to grow up beautiful. You want your child to have a best shot at life. And let's face it, beauty is important. You know, that's the way it is. It's important to grow the way nature is intended for you to grow. But if you have your mouth open, it leads to craniofacial abnormalities because the tongue isn't resting in the roof of the mouth. And if the tongue isn't resting in the roof of the mouth, the palate, which is the top jaw, that is more narrow and a high palate and V-shaped, and you have smaller jaws. The lower 50% of the face is influenced by the posture of the tongue. So when I'm talking about the lower 50% of the face, I'm talking about the top jaw, the maxilla, the lower jaw, the mandible. And as a result, that can be set back, and then that's going to encroach the airway. Like there's other factors as well that are feeding into why our children are mouth breathing. The foods that they are eating, like it is soft foods, not like our ancestors. The quality of the foods, the air that the children are breathing, high temperatures in houses, lack of circulation of air. So there's many, many factors. Maybe a child then is prone to allergies. Maybe they have nasal obstruction. Maybe they have enlarged adenoids. But I will say this, any mouth breathing child, if they get away with it for a few years, they're not going to get away with it for a long time. It soon catches up with them. And I was a mouth breathing child, and for me, up until about the age of 11, everything was pretty okay. In primary school, I was pretty good. I was up there. But it was when I went to secondary school. So I got away with it for a few years, and then I didn't get away with it. And I don't think children will get away with it because it's really, the mouth is open, their sleep is impacted, and their brain development is impacted. And people can look at the science in that. Go into Google and put in Karen Bonuck, Bonuck, and she did a paper on British kids, 11,049 children in the UK in Stratford-upon-Avon. So she looked at 11,049 children. She looked at them from age 6 months to 57 months. So it's a longitudinal study involving a large population. And her conclusion was children who have sleep issues at age 5, so we're talking about snoring, stopping breathing, and mouth breathing. Those were the 3 hallmark symptoms that she said. If these kids have sleep issues at age 5, and if they are not treated, by the time these kids reach 8 years of age, they have a 40% increased risk of special education needs. Now, That is absolutely scary, but beyond belief. And her paper is published in the journal Pediatrics. So it's a very high impact journal. Yeah. That's what I was saying to the listener. You may not be aware of that. You might have your child at home. Your child is snoring heavily. Snoring is not a good sign of the child because it indicates that the airway is restricted, that there's turbulent airflow. If air is not able to get so freely from the nose into the lungs and back out again, that child gets continuously pulled out of deep sleep. They spend less time in deep sleep and more time in light sleep. But when is the brain developing in the child? It's during deep sleep. So deep sleep is necessary for brain development. And if that child has sleep fragmentation and they're continuously being pulled out of deep sleep into light sleep, that can impact brain development. So it's a scary prospect because most parents are not told about it. And even if that parent brings their child to a pediatric doctor, how many pediatric doctors talk about mouth breathing? How many GPs talk about mouth breathing? How many nurses? So that parent then, she has met many healthcare professionals along the way, from the time that child is a young infant, all the way up, and not one of them are likely to have mentioned anything about mouth breathing. The dentist, in the main, may not even mention anything about mouth breathing. There are some doctors who absolutely know it. There are some dentists who are really pushing this forward. Airway growth dentists, functional orthodontists, and dentists who understand about the airways. But there are many healthcare professionals. They don't talk about it. They don't mention it, even though it's in the literature. But the problem, when it's in the literature, it's not accessible to the general population. Parents are not getting to hear about it. And that's where James Nestor's book was brilliant, because he was approaching it like, I'm a breathing instructor. This is my life. So people might say, well, I have a biased opinion. Well, you know what? I love teaching breathing, so I do have a bias to it. But James Nestor approached it from a journalist. Yeah. He doesn't make a living from teaching breathing. He is currently writing another book on a totally different subject. But if you were to read his book and look at what he says and compare it to what we are saying, the similarities there are they're uncanny. Like, it's just, we are all on the same hymn sheet with this one, and we need to get the information out there.
Yeah. Wow. And even, when you say treat a child as well, that's probably everything ranging from looking at the adenoids piece, the temperature of the room, the air quality in the house, the food they're eating. There's probably so much pieces to that when you look at children, and probably when you look at an adult as well, and even the tongue tie scenario. And that's definitely food for thought, for sure, because I think we would automatically, when we think, how do we improve their breathing, we look for instruments. We'd look for, like the sleep apnea mask, or we'd look for, something without looking at the root cause of what it really is. So that really, when you listed off them things, really made me think of all the different variables that are out there when somebody is experiencing a lot of mouth breathing. And also how you're training yourself to mouth breathe. Like the more you nose breathe, the more you nose breathe. The more you mouth breathe, the more you're going to do that. The body gets used to habitually that. So I think that's amazing to understand. And for adults as well, when they're thinking, wow, I've been, like you were saying, for a very long time and years, been mouth breathing. And you're actually able to correct that. But it does take, slow, measured work. And that's the daunting piece of it, because you're correcting possibly years of repetitive behavior around the way you breathe. So for me, it definitely took really significant concentration and effort every time I exercised. That's when I focused on it the most, that I was just very present and aware of the way I was breathing. For a lot of runs I did with no music or no podcast, because I just wanted to focus on the breath, because I knew I'd just go back to my norm, which was mouth breathing, if I didn't double down and actually be really present around it. And then also other pieces of the day where I was like, really focusing on my diaphragm, really focusing on the speed of my breath. Oxygen Advantage is your app, which teaches a lot of that. Patrick's app, am I right in saying that it would teach a lot about the different types of breathing, the speed, lots of other pieces. And that's an amazing resource that I delved into at that time a lot. But again, today I'm reminding myself, every time I do something that gets the heart rate up a lot, I still have the tendency to just, the mouth opens. So definitely awareness is a huge piece of this.
Yeah, it is. And, the other thing is, during physical exercise, there's a point at which the air hunger gets too high that you're not going to sustain nasal breathing. Mm-hmm. And nor do you have to. But what we would say is that anybody who wants to build up their aerobic base, they're going to typically do it in zone 1, zone 2. They're going to ramp up their heart rate maybe to about 130, 135 beats per minute. That can all be sustained with nasal breathing. Yeah. So you can still bring it into your way of life. And there's 2 points when it comes back to, I'm going to come back to women's sleep a little bit. Very often what's known about is snoring. Obstructive sleep apnea gets a lot of attention. Insomnia gets a lot of attention. There is also another condition called upper airway resistance syndrome. And it was first phrased back in 1993, so it's relatively recent. It was first phrased with children in 1982 and then adults in 1993. So upper airway resistance syndrome implies that when there is a resistance to a person's breathing during sleep, that resistance increases effort to breathe. And it's the increased effort to breathe that can take the person out of deep sleep. So it's different to obstructive sleep apnea. Now, say, for example, you have a female who is tired, and normally female with sleep issues aren't just tired, they are anxious. So anxiety is pretty high with this group of females. And she goes to do a sleep study. She knows there's something off. She does a sleep study. She does an overnight. Her blood oxygen saturation is monitored. The number of respiratory events is taken into consideration. How many apneas does she have? In other words, how many times did she stop breathing during sleep? How many hypopneas did she have? So how many times was there a reduction in the flow of her breathing? Okay. A lot of sleep studies don't pay attention to respiratory effort-related arousals. And that's the big one. Because females are less prone to sleep apnea and they are more prone to upper airway resistance syndrome. So if she does a sleep study, unless that sleep study is investigating, does she have respiratory effort-related arousals? And if she is more than 5 per hour, that's indicative of upper airway resistance syndrome. She may have fibromyalgia. She might have chronic fatigue syndrome. She may have conditions that are medically unexplained, but if she's not getting adequate sleep. But the real question is, even if she does a sleep study, what is the sleep study investigating? And that's a big one, because I've spoken to a couple of ENTs. They say that RERAs, respiratory effort related arousals, are investigated. But I've also spoken with many other people. They say they are not. So that's one point that I would like to make, that breathing and sleep in females is quite subtle. The second thing, Rebecca, is that insomnia or low arousal threshold, women can wake up quite easily from sleep. Now, this is different to men. Of course, stress can affect both men and women. Say, for example, if either has a really bad day at work, you might carry that home with you. Your mind is overthinking about it, and then you have difficulty falling asleep, or you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. But I think females have another thing, and probably this is a biological trait that with children, there were kind of, even though during sleep, there was always a certain degree of awareness of a child. If it was to cry in the background, the mom would wake up. So they can wake up quite easily from sleep. So this is called low arousal threshold. Now, the question to ask is then, what do you do if you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning? It's not an easy time to quieten the mind. And the mind has a tendency to think. And my solution here would be listen to a guided audio. Hand the problem over to something else. Have it downloaded to your phone. Your phone is on flight mode. Throw in a set of headphones. Listen to it and let it guide you back into sleep. Because again, anything that's telling the brain that there is a threat is going to take you out of sleep. If you're breathing a bit faster during sleep, if the temperature of the room is too hot, if the air is stuffy, if you're open mouth breathing. So these can take you out of deep sleep. And then you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're lying there. And the issue with insomnia or upper airway resistance, of low arousal threshold is that it puts you into an increased stress response, increased sympathetic drive. And that increased sympathetic drive carries into the day, and then from the day back into sleep. And it becomes a vicious cycle. And people then are often conditioned, oh, I'm a bad sleeper. My mother was a terrible sleeper. I'm just like my mother. And that's not the case.
No.
It really is not. But if we think that way, it can be.
Self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's interesting as well, like females do have a different stress threshold to men, especially when you get past your mid to late 30s, really, because the fluctuation of progesterone, and that's so connected to sleep. So there's also there's multiple factors of why a woman will have different sleep, lighter sleep. And I see that with, looking at my own sleep and my mother's sleep. I find that really interesting to look at the difference between, she's now in her mid 60s, I'm in my mid 30s, and how much her sleep duration and depth has changed. And she's always talking about her dreams as well. She's probably in a lighter sleep a lot more. So it's really interesting acknowledging that. And then the sleep needs of women as well been, for the most part, normal, especially when children are young. They need to be longer. That's normal, but we haven't normalized that. We've kind of said as a blanket statement, everyone needs 7 or 8 hours, which is really incorrect. It's so dependent on your mental load. And I actually spoke to someone the other day who's doing a lot of really intense training for an Ironman. And he was saying, he's needing 9 hours a night because there's obviously so much repair. Look at your lymphatic drainage that's happening. So it's a really interesting topic that I'm so passionate about, the circadian piece, and the breath is so in that piece. Like you cannot talk about good restorative sleep or optimal circadian health without taking into consideration your breathing. So totally. That's really interesting. Actually, I've really taken a lot away from what you've said today, especially around the different female needs, but also when you're assessing someone, all the different factors that lead to mouth breathing, suboptimal breathing. So there was one last question I had, which is, there seems to be a rise as well in hyperbaric chambers. And I just love your take on them and if it's connected.
I think they're very good. I think one downside to it is that they're quite expensive. Yeah. And if you have, say, somebody with chronic fatigue syndrome or somebody who really needs it, they may not be able to afford it. So the whole premise of a hyperbaric, so when we think about hyperbaric, we think of increased increased atmosphere. So atmospheric pressure here at sea level is about 760 mil. And air will always go from high pressure to low pressure. Inside in the chamber, the pressure is increased. So you are going to be taking, per breath, increased oxygen molecules. And it's not going to necessarily increase the saturation of hemoglobin all that much, because during normal breathing, it's already 98%, 97%. So it will increase it anyway to 100. It will fully saturate the hemoglobin. But it will increase oxygen diffusing into the blood, into the plasma. And that means then that your plasma, which doesn't carry all that much oxygen normally, it's about 1.5%, that's going to increase. So oxygen is diffusing from the lungs into the plasma and then from the plasma to the tissues and organs. So it is a direct way of getting there. So I think definitely if you can afford it, it's useful. you know, and I've spoken to many people over the years. I can't remember ever getting a bad account of it.
Yeah.
So I will say, yes, it can be a very good approach, but also think about your everyday breathing pattern, because you can influence oxygen delivery. You know, if you breathe in and out through your nose, you automatically increase the partial pressure of oxygen going from the lungs into the blood. And the reason being is because of just a better gas exchange, because of the redistribution of blood throughout the lungs, more open airways, more open capillaries. And then you can also increase oxygen transfer from the blood to the tissues when you think of carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
So you can influence a lot yourself. But I think, hyperbaric is one part of it. Now, I know I meant to talk about children as well. If you suspect a child is, or you feel as a parent that your child is mouth breathing, and you may be thinking, well, is it the adenoids or is it hay fever? I'm not quite sure. Why does the child have the mouth open? Is it because of nasal obstruction? Where is the nasal obstruction, or is it a habit? What I would suggest is sit your child down, practice a simple nose and blocking exercise. It involves holding the breath and nodding the head up and down as the child holds the breath. There's free videos online. I've put out the complete program free for children. And just see, can your child breathe easier through the nose as a result of doing the exercise? If your child can breathe easier from doing the exercise, then you know that at least part of the problem is the rhinitis. The child has a stuffy nose. Yeah. And then the question to ask is, can the child not only breathe easier through the nose, but can the child breathe comfortably through their nose for 3 minutes? And if that child can breathe comfortably through their nose for 3 minutes, after doing 5 or 6 reps of the head nodding while holding the breath exercise, then you know that the child, you can help that child transition from mouth to nose breather, because that child's nose is working okay for them. You're not forcing nasal breathing to the child. You already know the child can breathe comfortably through their nose for 3 minutes. See if they can walk with their mouth closed. Encourage the child to breathe through the nose, because I will genuinely say it's one of the best things we can impart to any kids. And I know working with kids, you know, it has challenges, and parents working with kids can even be more challenging, goes completely over their heads. But at the same time, we can be planting a message.
Yeah, I love that. Patrick, your brain needs to be studied. There's a lot in there I'd love to extract more of. But where can people find you? We said Oxygen Advantage app, but where else can people see your work?
Yeah, if people read books, I've 11 books. The most recent one is The Breathing Cure for Better Sleep, which would be quite applicable to what the conversation we're having today. Yeah. And we're on social media, Oxygen Advantage, and we're also Buteco Clinic, and websites of the same name as well. So YouTube videos, Instagram, TikTok, you know, and myotape as well. So if you're looking at a safe way to get the lips together during sleep, and also as a training children during the day to switch to nasal breathing, the tape is called Myo. So that's myotape.com.
Oh, incredible conversation. Wow, that was such an incredible conversation with Patrick. It just reinforces how essential it is to stay aware of your breath, and how easy it is for us to become shallow breathers and really dysregulated, because we're spinning so many plates and we're so busy juggling everything. So if you are struggling with sleep, anxiety, constantly feeling on edge, really start paying attention to the breath. It's going to pay you back tenfold. And if you got something from this, I would absolutely love if you shared it with a friend. And hopefully I'll see you in the next podcast.